Welcome back to Luke's Properties YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to break down why I gave back a rent-to-rent deal that was making me £1,000 per month. I think it's good to talk about all the wins, but it's also good to talk about the losses. So this is the second part of a 3-part series where I discussed 3 rent-to-rent properties that we had to give back for different reasons. This one was making us £1,000 per month in profit, and after around 2 years, I had to give it back to the estate agent for various reasons, which we'll cover in this video. So just to give you a brief overview of this property, it was a 6-bedroom house that we rented from an estate agent for £925 per month. Bear in mind, this is back in 2018, I believe, so a long time ago now. Rents were a lot cheaper than they are now. The property had previously been an HMO, but when we rented it, the license had actually expired. We needed to get an HMO license renewal, which was something we were discussing with the estate agent and the landlord. But we initially rented the 6-bedroom house for £925 per month. We then invested some money into refurbishing the house, mainly sanding the floors down, staining the floors and furnishing the rooms. And we rented each room out for £400 per month to working professionals. And after all of our expenses, we were making around £1,000 per month in profit. Not bad, right? But there were some problems that we experienced along the way. So there were constant boiler failures. The boiler kept breaking and we were always getting complaints from the tenants saying the heating was off, the hot water was off. And trying to explain this to the landlord through the estate agent was proving difficult. Back then, I was still very new to the business. I didn't really know my rights as a company tenant. The agent was being quite difficult and they weren't being very helpful when we were asking to communicate with the landlord. So we ended up taking out British Gas cover for the boiler ourselves. So whenever the boiler broke, we could call British Gas, they'd come out, fix it and be on their way. And that worked, you know, for the first year, 18 months or so. But the boiler break-in started to become more of a regular occurrence, like every 6 weeks. British Gas would come out, fix it as best they could, and then in another 6 weeks to 2 months it would break again. So this was becoming an issue. Because the house was old and poorly maintained, there was also some damp, leaks and structural issues. Because the landlord hadn't invested back into the property, when winter came around there'd often be some leaks, there'd be some damp that would start to show itself, and again we would get complaints from the tenants and they'd ask us to fix these issues. And whenever I'd mention them to the estate agent would speak to the landlord and we'd get the same sort of response. The landlord lived in Dubai, they didn't want to invest any money back into the house, so most of the problems were pretty much left to us, which wasn't ideal. And I would never put myself in this situation again, but I was new to the business and I wasn't quite sure what I was responsible for as the rent-to-rent operator and what the agent and the landlord were responsible for. So I learned a lot of valuable lessons from this property. So communication with the landlord was difficult. I couldn't communicate with him directly, only through the agent, which was stressful. We spoke to the HMO department and they sent out a licensing officer to give us an inspection. They gave us 48 mandatory improvements to make to the house before the HMO license was renewed. These were lots of small jobs, but they still added up. They were things like adding self-closing hinges to the doors, adding intermittent fire strips to the doors, keeping the hallways clear, putting bars on some of the windows upstairs because they were really tall windows and old. There was loads of these small improvements that we had to make, and I always remember seeing the list and remembering that number of 48 and thinking, wow, that's a lot of work to do. And again, the landlord didn't want to pay for any of this work, which was quite stressful. So we ended up paying for all of this work. We paid for an HMO license after completing the work, and then we didn't hear from the council for another 4 to 6 months after that. Then COVID hit. We lost all of our tenants. They all moved back abroad where they were from. We had an empty house that we just spent thousands of pounds on, which wasn't ideal at all. We then started marketing to key workers. I think we filled 3 or 4 rooms with nurses and other key workers. And I think at this stage we was pretty much breaking even, so the house was paying for itself, but we weren't making any profit. And over this 2-year period of renting this house, altogether we had invested around £8,000, including the refurbishment, including the improvements that we made, and including the first 2 months rent. So even though we had made some money, the problems were starting to outweigh the profit that we were making, and the cons were starting to outweigh the pros, because there was always an issue with this house. We just couldn't make it work. There was always a leak, there was always damp, there was always a boiler issue. It was starting to become more stress than it was worth. So here's some of the lessons that I learned from this house. Some houses are just too tired to save. Some houses are going to be in such bad condition that you would actually need to spend £20,000 to £30,000 on improving them and getting them up to standard. And with rent to rent, you don't want to spend that much, because you don't own the asset. And if the landlord isn't willing to play ball and do their side of the deal by being a good landlord and making improvements, then sometimes you can get stuck with a house that's just too tired to save and needs too much work doing to it. So a lesson I learned from this house is, if the house requires an expensive refurbishment and the landlord won't pay, then just walk away. There's plenty other landlords, plenty other HMOs that are in better condition with better landlords who will invest in their property and will be easier to work with. So just go and find those people. Don't work with these guys who don't want to put a penny back into their asset because they're old dinosaurs and they're not good landlords and they're not good people to work with. The third lesson was, don't get emotionally attached to properties. Even though we made around £15,000 over those 2 years from an £8,000 investment, I still think I could have cut my losses a lot sooner. To only make £7,000 in 2 years with all the stress that came with it, I don't know if it was really worth it. Yes, we made some money, but the stress and the operational drag that this house put on our business, in hindsight, it wasn't really worth it. Although we did learn a lot from renting this house. When I look back now, the lessons were the best part of this house. The £7,000 wasn't really worth it for the stress that it caused. By getting emotionally attached to this house, I kept it for 2 years and I tried everything to try and make it work. Every time it broke, I'd fix it. I even paid for the HMO license. When COVID hit and we lost tenants, I then went and found key workers to go into this house. I put so much effort into this house, and not just me, my small team at the time, my girlfriend, my dad, we all put so much effort into this house. But because we were working with a landlord who had no intention of investing back into their property and no intention of keeping the house in good working condition, it was an uphill struggle and one we could have done without. So had I not got so emotionally attached to this house, I could have walked away a lot sooner and then used my effort and energy elsewhere with better properties and better landlords. I could have made more money without the stress. I also learned that you can work with the council. They'll help you if you're transparent. One thing I will say about the council, with this house in particular, was they were quite helpful. They worked with us. The whole time we were trying to make improvements to the property, we were still renting it out as an HMO, and the council were quite fair in that respect. They allowed us to operate because they could see we were trying to do the right thing. They could see that the landlord wasn't being very helpful, but they gave us the benefit of the doubt and they worked with us and they were patient, which we appreciated and I respect. So I learned that sometimes the council can be helpful. They're not all out to get you. It just depends who they send on the day or who you speak to on the phone, you know. The main lesson I learned from this house was to know when to cut my losses and free up my energy for better deals. The outcome of this rent-to-rent deal was that we still made profit overall. Like I said, we turned £8,000 into £15,000 in 2 years, which is still pretty good going, but the stress that came with it, I don't know if it was worth it. Although these lessons that we learned have been very beneficial to us in the long term. By doing a rent-to-rent with this house, I learned what types of houses and landlords to avoid. I became more efficient and focused on moving forward. So that's the great thing about rent-to-rent. Even when things go wrong, they still work out to be okay. We still made some money, we learned some valuable lessons, and overall, this rent-to-rent deal did make us better as a business. It made us more efficient, and we learned so much from this rent-to-rent deal. This is why I say, just jump and take the leap, because you can learn so much more from being in the field rather than watching from the sidelines. And as I said, we still managed to make money and we learned loads. If you want me to help you get your first 1 to 3 rent-to-rent properties within the next 180 days guaranteed, then I'll leave a link in the description below. There'll be a link to my calendar where you can book a call with me. On that call, we'll have a conversation and work out if we're a good fit for each other. If not, then keep watching my videos, learn from my experiences and try and do better. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.